Stefan Koelsch from the University of Bergen. Welcome, Stefan.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure. It's nice to see many of my friends in the auditorium here and some of my students. So I would like to shout out a special hello to them. I will talk about brain correlates of emotions and also how I investigate them with music. And I wanted to start with an illustration of emotional response. So auditory information can evoke visceromotor or autonomic responses via the inferior colliculus of the brain stem. And in addition, the vestibular nerve also contains a substantial amount of acoustically responsive fiber. And the vestibular nuclear complex actually exerts influence on ocular and spinal motor neurons in response to sounds, particularly to sounds with low frequency and sudden onsets. Moreover, both the vestibular nuclei and the auditory cochlear nuclei project to the reticular formation, and the vestibular nucleus also projects to the parabrachial nucleus, which is situated around here in the brainstem. And the parabrachial nucleus is a convergence site for vestibular, visceral, and autonomic processing. Both the vestibular nuclei, so nuclei that receive information from the vestibular system, and the auditory cochlear nuclei project to the reticular formation, and the vestibular nucleus also projects to the parabrachial nucleus. So also situated here in the brainstem. And the parabrachial nucleus is a convergence site for vestibular and visceral and autonomic processing. And such projections initiate and support movements, and they contribute to the arousing effects of music. And I wanted to share this with you because it illustrates that even the earliest auditory processing stages give rise to effective responses to music. And this is why I like to speak of an auditory limbic pathway, which is indicated here in light blue, which also includes the auditory thalamus, the auditory cortex, and the amygdala. Yeah, and beyond the phylogenetically old brainstem systems, which are in part the basis for our visceral reactions to music, several forebrain systems also contribute to emotional experiences. So this is illustrated here. These are result of a recent meta-analysis of 47 functional neuroimaging studies, illustrating several neural correlates of emotions evoked with music. And the studies included in this analysis used various experimental approaches, such as investigating emotional responses to consonant or dissonant music, music sounding happy or sad, music that evoked joy or fear, musical expectancy violations, music evoked tension, music evoked chills or musical frissons, and so on. Now, this meta-analysis indicates clusters of activity changes that are reported across the top left. You can see clusters in the amygdala with local maxima in the superficial and the lateral-basal amygdala, and in the anterior hippocampal formation. B here shows clusters in the caudate nucleus and the ventral striatum with local maxima in the nucleus accumbens. The middle panel shows auditory regions in the superior temporal gyrus. The bottom panel left shows clusters in the cingulate cortex, the orbitofrontal cortex, and in the right bottom panel, you can see clusters in the inferior colliculus and here in the parietal operculum. Now, I will not discuss all of these clusters, but only make a few remarks on some of these results. First, with regard to the nucleus accumbens, the nucleus accumbens is sensitive to primary rewards, such as food, drink, or sex, and secondary rewards, for example, money or power. It is involved in representing hedonic value and motivates, initiates, and invigorates behaviors aimed at obtaining rewards and consuming rewards. And therefore, I also refer to the nucleus accumbens as the fun motor in the brain. This fun motor is dopamine. In addition to the cluster in the ventral striatum, so in the nucleus accumbens here, the meta-analysis also indicated a cluster in the dorsal striatum, here in the head of the caudate nucleus. And the pattern of this co-activation in the ventral and dorsal striatum corresponds exactly to activations in response to monetary rewards, food rewards, and erotic rewards. This here is from a meta-analysis on the processing of primary and secondary rewards by Guillaume Cescus. So such activations are to a substantial amount due to dopaminergic activity. Here is one of my favorite neuroscience studies on music and emotion by Valerie Salimpour from Robert Satori's group. And they investigated neural correlates of music-evoked chills or music-evoked frissons, that is, intensely pleasurable responses to music, often involving goosebumps, shivers down the neck or spine. So this was a PET experiment in which they used a tracer called raclopride to measure dopamine availability in the brain. And in this experiment, each participant brought a piece of music into the lab to which he or she would experience such a chill. And as a control stimulus, that person listened to the music of another subject. So the authors report that during listening to chill-evoking music, increased dopamine availability was measured in the caudate nucleus, the putamen, which is also part of the basal ganglia, and in the nucleus accumbens, that is, in the ventral striatum. And this shows us that music-evoked pleasure involves dopamine release into the striatum, that is, activation of the dopaminergic mesolimbic reward pathway. And this also has important therapeutic implications for the therapeutic use of music, and I will talk about this also in the end of my presentation. The finding that musical pleasure involves dopaminergic activity has then been confirmed by other studies, for example, by this study here by Laura Ferrari, where availability of dopamine was modulated by administration of levodopa or risperidone, and it was found that such modulation of dopamine availability results in higher or lower pleasure ratings of music. Now let me go back to the meta-analysis on reward. I've mentioned here these striatal activations that you see in the circles here. And in addition to the striatal activations, the authors here reported that primary and secondary rewards also engage a number of other structures in the brain, such as the ventromedial orbitofrontal cortex, cingulate cortex, amygdala, anterior insula, and mediodorsal thalamus. The Latin names of these structures are not so important here. What's important here is that reward is not only processed in the fun motor, the nucleus accumbens in the brain, but also involves an extensive network in the brain. Now, strikingly, this entire network shows up in this meta-analysis on music-evoked emotions, including ventral and dorsal striatum, orbitofrontal cortex, here, for example, cingulate cortex, amygdala, and with subthreshold significance also the insula and the mediodorsal thalamus. That's not shown here. So this indicates that much of what we see in this meta-analysis is associated with the evoked pleasure. And interestingly, this pleasure network overlaps substantially with the so-called pain network, which typically also includes thalamus, insula, secondary somatosensory cortex, and the paracortex, and so forth. And this is probably due, or it's probably, let's say it's probably due to this overlap between pain and pleasure systems in the brain that music can modulate pain. So here, music reduces pain intensity levels and opioid requirements. However, this meta-analysis also reported that the magnitude of these benefits drugs, but there are also ways to increase these effects, and that's something that we also study at the moment in our laboratory. Now, I've already said that much of what we see in this meta-analysis is associated with the experience of music-evoked pleasure. So such pleasure might arise, for example, from the experience of beauty, from emotion regulation, from triggering pleasurable memories, and from social bonding. And this is where perhaps the most interesting finding of this analysis comes into play, namely these clusters here in the anterior hippocampal formation. So an overwhelming proportion of studies on music-evoked emotions have reported activity changes within the anterior hippocampal formation. And this stays in striking contrast to monetary rewards, food-related rewards, and erotic rewards, which do not activate the hippocampus, as evident from the meta-analysis on reward processing that I've showed you. Now, activation of the anterior hippocampus is, I think, a very interesting capacity of music, and it indicates that music-evoked emotions are not related to reward alone. And in the following, I will argue that music easily stimulates social bonding and evokes attachment-related emotions, and that such attachment-related emotions are generated in the hippocampus. Now, this here is from a review by Brian Strange, who showed that the hippocampal formation has, on the one hand, dense bidirectional connections with the amygdala, that's shown here in the right panel, but also with the nucleus accumbens, that's shown here in the middle panel, and the hypothalamus, that's shown here in the left panel. Now, interestingly, a predominantly anterior hippocampal domain projects to the hypothalamic medial zone, this one here, and the hypothalamic medial zone nuclei form circuits involved not only in integrating innate defensive responses, for example, to environmental threats, but they are also involved in mediating reproductive and social behaviors. So these nuclei mediate, for example, release of oxytocin, and in addition, hypothalamic projections also regulate social bonding via endogenous opioids. So opioids that are produced in the brain. Also note that in the course of evolution, the hippocampal formation, which is indicated here in blue, was later differentiated than the diencephalon, which is here in green. So that is later than the system for pleasure and pain and craving, we might say. The system that also involves the nucleus accumbens. So with regard to the hippocampus and the differentiation of the hippocampal formation during evolution, it's important to note that mammals and birds need to nurse and care for the offspring. That is, they need to feel attached to the offspring, to recognize the offspring, and they need to be able to remember the way back to the nest with the offspring. And all of these functions seem to be co-localized in the hippocampus, especially in the anterior hippocampus with regard to emotional processes, and in the more posterior parts with regard, for example, to spatial orientation, navigation, and so forth. So these pieces of evidence led us to the notion of a hippocampus-centered affect system, emotions. And I refer to this affect system also as the happiness system in the brain. Now, in humans, attachment-related emotions are associated with feelings such as sympathy, compassion, tenderness, peacefulness, kindness, and the feeling of being moved. And we associate these emotions with joy and happiness. And on the other hand, when social attachments are severed, it can lead to sadness or unhappiness. Campus plays a role in attachment-related emotions. An important link to music comes into play. So music is special in how it supports and promotes social functions, such as contact between individuals, communication, cooperation, coordination of movements, cooperation between individuals, thus promoting social cohesion and social attachments. And engaging in these social functions is a human need, and the fulfillment of this need is perceived as pleasurable and can even make us happy. And that is why I refer to the hippocampus-centered affect system as the happiness system. And exclusion from social functions, on the other hand, makes us unhappy. It has negative health effects and leads to increased mortality. I also wanted to highlight here emotional synchronization, or copathy, as I like to call it, and synchronization of movements, that is, movement coordination between individuals. For example, when we clap together, stomp together, dance together, play instruments together, sing together, etc. Such synchronization appears to promote social bonding. So here is a model by Robin Dunbar and colleagues making a strong connection between synchronization to music and social bonding. Here, synchronization of movements between humans leads to increased trust, increased cooperation. Many nice studies on this topic, which are reviewed in this article. And thus, synchronization leads also to increased social bonding. And the authors here also make a strong point that the endogenous opioid system in the brain is activated by synchronization, and that this endogenous opioid system is also involved in social bonding, as well in the reduction of pain and anxiety, by the way. So they argue that non-sexual, non-kinship social bonds well, let me phrase it differently. They argue that the endogenous opioids, and particularly endorphins, play a central role in the establishment and maintenance of such non-sexual, non-kinship social bonds. And that particularly endorphins are important candidates for the hormonal or neurohormonal underpinnings of social bonding during group musical activities. So I highly recommend to have a look at this review article. I also wanted to highlight here that the ability to synchronize movements, including vocalizations, flexibly in a group to an external pulse, namely the tactus, is uniquely human. And I believe that this ability is the simplest cognitive function that just separates us from animals. Simply synchronizing, for example, clapping or stomping or vocalizing within a group to a tactus, flexibly. That is, a tactus that might be faster, slower, or accelerate or decelerate. And if this is true, then this would make music the decisive evolutionary step of the Homo sapiens, maybe even of the genus Homo. So music usually has a pulse and a scale. Of course, there are exceptions, but usually if a signal produced by humans has a pulse and a scale, we recognize it usually as music. And that is also what makes music special, okay? And by virtue of these two fundamental musical principles, pulse and scale, music immediately affords that several individuals produce sounds together. And this is in contrast to language, which also has many musical features, of course, speech, melody, timbre, rhythm, etc. But language is best understood when produced by one individual at a time. Only one person can talk at the same time, otherwise it does not sound good, and we cannot understand what is being said. But with music, several persons can produce sounds at the same time, and it still sounds good. One can still understand the music. And language was evolutionarily adaptive because individuals could communicate what they think, what they want, what moves them, etc. And music was evolutionarily adaptive because it brought the capacity to establish and support group cohesion. And therefore, I believe, without music, humankind would not have made it through evolution. Yeah, and finally, I wanted to mention that the activation and stimulation of limbic and paralimbic structures in the brain with music has valuable therapeutic effects. So many disorders and diseases are associated with dysfunction or structural abnormalities in the brain structures implicated in music-evoked emotions. For example, amygdala, hippocampal formation, the mesolimbic dopaminergic pathway, cingulate cortex, etc. So, chronic disorders and diseases include most, or let's say most, if not all, chronic disorders and diseases include, for example, depression, pathological anxiety, bipolar disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, even chronic diseases of the immune system, which are often prone to stress, and so forth. And the fact that we now know that music-evoked emotions activate and modulate neural activity in these structures gives rise to research investigating effects of music and music therapy on functional and structural changes in the mentioned brain structures. And I do believe that regulating dysfunctions in these structures with music has therapeutic effects. That's all I wanted to share with you today. Thank you very much for listening.